Hey, it's Vinia. I like to talk about the combat stats, items in the item shop, and the biggest topic of the newly released video, bonds, emblem rings, and what we saw. When I saw the video, I couldn't exactly hold in my excitement, as Somniel is based similarly to my castle from Fates, or if you're familiar with the three houses, the monastery. The whole thing looks great, and I hope Sami doesn't reach the same fate as Lilith. But let's get into it. First, I like to talk about the combat stats as we know so far. You'll be familiar with the more known stats like physical, magic, defense, etc., while new stats are reintroduced like dodge and build, while others did not make an appearance as in charisma and weight. If you have not played the last entry, dex is the new skill stat. Interestingly, both stats, dodge, and luck are shown in the game. Luck in previous games was the primary stat and present in Fire Emblem games, while dodge was not. It remained as a behind-the-scenes stat with the exception of Path of Radiance and its sequel, Radiant Dawn, where both remain present. Both primarily do the same thing and can be considered interchangeable when looking at both side by side. Both will 90% of the time be the same and reflect upon each other, while until dodge is affected by some outside influence, with which luck would be the primary stat plus abilities or support bonuses. Next is the stat I would like to talk about is build, abbreviated as BLD. It was primarily known as Constitution, which is affected by characters with mounts. It determines if a weapon can be carried without penalty to their attack speed, as well as the ability to use rescue and capture. Charisma is not in the game as they are tied to the battalions in three houses. And lastly, weight is also not a part of the game visually. The stat will technically be around, but affecting speed directly like Fates, or with build being an added stat and tie in with the speed. Next on the list, I'd like to talk about the weapons and items that we saw in the item shop. But first, let's go over what they reintroduced inside of Engage. Trinity of Magic, last seen in Radiant Dawn, is not present in this game, and the revised weapon triangle presented in Fates and Heroes will also not be present. They brought back the weapon triangle, more variations to it. Gauntlets will have an advantage over bows, tomes, and daggers. In addition to the triangle, an attacker will inflict the break status on the targeted unit while having advantage on the weapon triangle. The status effect will not allow counterattacks. Looking over the armory shop presented, we can see a total of 7 categories of weapons and showing a little bit of swords and lances. Most of these weapons are familiar to us except slim weapons. As you can guess from the name itself, slim weapons are thinner, which means that they are accurate and light for swift use. They have lower power compared to the iron sword and have a slight crit chance. These slim weapons were last seen in Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn, and will only be available for the swords and lances. Looking at the top right of the categories of weapons, we will see daggers or quote knives as said by Nintendo NA. These types of weapons were seen in Path of Radiance, Radiant Dawn, Fates, and Heroes. Fates carried a similar category but placed them as a new weapon as a shuriken type. In Heroes, daggers are available but with the shuriken icon. Daggers in most games are considered to be dex based, not relying on strength alone, and were suited much more for classes such as thieves and assassins. In Path of Radiance, a sage character could wield these types of weapons as a secondary but are not necessarily needed, as mage characters in recent games can just blast enemies with their own magic anyways. In Radiant Dawn, the daggers were divided into melee and range, with knives being inferior to daggers. Fates changed the difference by making them one and the same, but they still had the same treatment when it came to melee and ranged, with the exception that it debuffed the targeted unit. Heroes use the same treatment as Fates does. So based on this information, my thoughts would be that the daggers would be more suitable from both melee and range, with range being the preferred method of attacking and debuffing enemies. These types of weapons are recommended for dex-based units. Starting from the bottom of the item list that we see, tonics are historically added and taken out of Fire Emblem games, worth about 150 gold in most of the games they appear in. Tonics affect the main stats in the game such as HP, magic, strength, dexterity, speed, and there is luck, but we can just toss that out of there. Pure water affects the resistance, and even though there is a resistance tonic that had existed in previous games, we can most likely guess that all tonics ever presented will be available in the game. whether it's through the shop, limited in stock, or located on the battlefield. To go over some of the tonics, the HP tonic increases a unit's max HP by 5 for one full chapter or skirmish, and the other tonics, insert the stat here, will temporarily insert a unit stat by 2 for one full chapter or skirmish. Going further up the list, we can see that torches will make a comeback in this game. Used primarily in fogged missions to increase visibility over a set range of tiles and gradually shrink over the course of a player's turn. Although useful in that particular mission, they aren't commonly used outside of it, and the item most likely will be used once or twice throughout a single playthrough, so there isn't a need to stock up on torches. Next, we see stabs on the list in the shop. These are my favorite things to see as an option items to use, which in their own right can be powerful when used correctly. I'll go over them really quickly as some of them have been making their ways back into the Fire Emblem series, and some of them are, and one of them that we can actually see is pretty new. Obstruct is a staff with 10 uses priced at 500 gold each. While the name is introduced as a passive skill in Heroes, the item should similarly work in the same way, as that it blocks foes moving through adjacent spaces to the caster casting it. This will be the first time we see this item. The staff has plenty of uses and is affordable. I would think the rank to use it would be fairly elementary, that even a knight could use it. Next is Silence. This item has shown up time and time again and is the most memorable one. The common rank is B and it prevents a user from using magic for one turn. And then finally, the last item, Freeze, was the last seen in Fates. Its primary use is to prevent an enemy from moving, and it could have additional effects such as reducing a targeted unit's avoidance, but we'll see that later on and how that reflects upon the game. Rings are the new mechanics, introducing 12 protagonists from their respective games, although these are not really set in stone, as Day 1 DLC introduces 2 more rings, the 3 House Royals and Tiki. They have a whole range of depth to them, most notably inherent skills. To gain these skills, you will have to level up the bonds of each of these rings to gain a certain amount of SP, or skill points, to unlock skills from those rings. The total amount of skills we will have are 6 slots. 3 from the character and 3 from the emblem ring, with the player themselves having 7 slots. And the bond level on these rings seem to be a max level of 10, as we can see on the top right of the screen, where most of the characters' bonds at 10 or below. The next set of ring mechanics will be creating bond rings, which will require bond fragments. The amount you will receive most likely be linked to activities throughout Somniel, as fishing gives out 20, feeding Sami gives 100, thus making the grind for these fragments. There are 4 grades to each of these bond rings. There is a C rank, B, A, and S. C giving out 1 stat, B giving out 2 stats, and A giving out 3 stats. We have yet to see anything related to the S stat of the rings, but they look like they have fixed stats on them, and they aren't random, as we see when they pull out the 10 pulls. To upgrade these rings to a higher rank, you'll need more bond fragments and a certain amount of rings. Agma didn't come with the initial 10 pull, which was 1,000 fragments. Getting from C to B will be 100 frags and 2 C rings of that character. To get B to A, you will need another 1,000 fragments and 3 B rings of that character. So I've calculated about 3,100 fragments so far, if you got lucky with each of those pulls. Time and effort will be made for these rings, and I don't doubt the DLC will come with an easier way to farm these fragments, as they usually have DLC that gives out gold for missions and other factors like classes, weapons, and an easier way to level. Earlier, we saw bond rings obtained with 0 out of 40 and 4 rings in each row. I've counted 8 different characters under Marth's bond rings. There would be 10 characters total in this list, with ranks C, B, A, and S as I listed before. The stats from these bond rings can be equipped and boost stats when synced with the emblem character. These are the 3 main things I wanted to talk about with the newly released video, but that concludes my thoughts and quick reactions to everything else in the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and perhaps you can consider giving a like and a sub, but as always, have a wonderful day.